Red Creek Ranch wasn't the biggest in the Wyoming Territory, nor the richest, but for Clay Thatcher, it was the only home that had ever made sense. Nestled along the reddish cliffs where the creek ran fast and cold through a jagged ravine, the ranch had stood for nearly 2 decades. Clay had built it himself after returning from the war with a shattered leg and a haunted stare. No family left, no promises waiting, just the open land and the will to tame it. In those early years, he worked the land like a man possessed, with only a mule, an old rifle, and the stubbornness of a soldier who had outlived his comrades. Clay fenced off a patch of grazing land, dug a well by hand, and built a single-room cabin with rough pine boards. He slept on a dirt floor for 3 winters, by the time he could afford floorboards. He had cattle grazing and a reputation among the neighboring ranchers, a reputation for fairness, grit, and quiet resolve. Though land didn't come easy. Coyotes killed his calves. A flash flood in '58 took out half his fence line. A blizzard in '62 froze 20 of his best heifers. But Clay never complained. He rebuilt, rebought, and rebranded, burning the letters RCR into the hides of each animal he raised. Red Creek Ranch became known for strong, well-fed cattle and a rancher who didn't flinch when trouble came knocking. But the trouble coming now was different. It started with smoke. Clay smelled it before he saw it, an acrid sting on the wind. While he was fixing a broken gate near the north pasture, his eyes narrowed. He turned toward the horizon, where a dark coil of smoke curled up from behind a hill. His chest tightened. That was the direction of the hay barn. He rode hard. By the time Clay crested the ridge and galloped down into the yard, the barn was an inferno. Flames licked through the slats of drywood like they were paper. His horse reared from the heat, and Clay jumped down, waving his arms and shouting for Josie Acute. Double quotes, Josie Acute. Grab water, the pump. Now, the old ranch hand came running with a bucket, already coughing from the smoke. Together they made a futile attempt to douse the blaze, but the fire had too much head start. Sparks flew like fireflies into the brittle grass. Clay shielded his face with a wet bandana and backed away, helpless. The barn collapsed in a thunder of falling timber. Inside, hundreds of dollars worth of hay meant to feed his herd through the coming winter burn to ash. An hour later, the town marshal rode in with 2 deputies, kicking up a trail of dust behind him. Marshal Dobbins was a grizzled lawman who knew better than to insult a man like Clay with platitudes. Could have been lightning, Dobbins muttered, standing with Clay near the smoking ruins. Clay didn't answer right away. His face was streaked with soot, and his gray eyes burned brighter than the fire had. Hasn't rained in 2 weeks, he said finally, and I stack my hay right. No spark from inside. This was started. Dobbins didn't argue. He pulled out a matchbook and struck one, lighting a small cigar. You been having problems with triple spur lately? Clay didn't nod. He didn't have to. Everyone in Sweetwater County knew that Alton Briggs was buying up land like a starving man at a feast. Briggs had been a nobody 10 years ago, just another East Coast boy playing cowboy, but his father's money bought him cattle, men, and influence. Now, Briggs owned more land than anyone north of the Snake River, and he wasn't done yet. He made offers generous at first, threatening later. Some ranchers caved. Others were forced out when their fences were mysteriously cut, their cattle stolen, or their wells poisoned. Clay had received one of those offers last month. A man in a long black coat rode up with a folded note from Briggs. Sell Red Creek, name your price, or face the consequences. Clay crumpled the paper and tossed it into the fire. He never replied. Now his hay barn was gone. You going to press charges? Dobbins asked, eyes on the smoke. Clay spat into the dirt. I press charges. He'll just send lawyers, or worse, Dobbins nodded. You want protection. Clay turned and looked toward the ridge, beyond which his cattle grazed under a setting sun. He saw his life spread out across the land fences, built by hand, fields seeded with blood and sweat. This wasn't just property. This was identity. Legacy, no, Clay said. I'll handle it. Dobbins exhaled a long breath, flicked ash from his cigar. War's coming, Clay, you know. That I do. That night, Clay sat on the porch with a Winchester across his knees. The wind howled across the land like it was warning him. Jose sat nearby, slowly sharpening his knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic scraping filled the silence between them. Briggs won't stop with fire, Jose said quietly. Clay nodded. Then we won't stop with warnings. From the ridge, coyotes howled in the distance. The stars blinked above the wide Wyoming sky, and Clay felt the old ache in his leg stir like it always did before a fight. The land was under siege, but so was something deeper, something men like Briggs could never buy or bully honor. And Clay Thatcher, last man standing at Red Creek, was ready to fight for it. 2 days after the fire, the riders came. Clay spotted the dust trail long before he heard the hoof beats. From the front porch of Red Creek Ranch, he leaned forward in his chair, hand resting casually on the rifle across his lap. The Wyoming sun was sharp and unforgiving, casting long shadows over the dry land as 5 riders approached from the east. Their horses moved in formation tight, disciplined, like men trained to send a message. Jose stepped out of the bunkhouse, wiping his hands on a rag. He squinted at the figures in the distance. Triple spur. Clay nodded once. The lead rider was a tall, lean man with a polished black duster and a silver star pinned to his chestnut law, but the kind of badge triple spurs men wore to play sheriff on their own land. His horse was sleek and well-fed, like everything else Alton Briggs owned. The man pulled up just beyond the front gate and tipped his hat in mock politeness. Morning, Mr. Thatcher, he called. Name's Holt. I work for Mr. Briggs. Clay didn't move. That right? Yes, sir. He sent me to make one final offer. You've been holding out, and frankly, that's a problem. Mr. Briggs is prepared to pay well above market value. He even said you could keep the house and a head, just for sentiment. Jose muttered something in Spanish that Clay didn't. Need translated. Clay stood slowly and stepped down from the porch. He moved with a limp, but his posture was straight, his presence unmistakably steady. I built this land with my own hands, he said, voice low but firm. Cut fence from timber. Dug that well myself. Watched good men bleed in the snow to protect it. You think I'd trade it for silver and a pat on the head? Holt's grin faltered. He looked back at the other riders' hired guns. By the look of them, tough and twitchy. One had a scar over his lip. Another wore a pistol low, like he wanted an excuse to draw. None of them met Clay's eyes. I understand pride, Holt said, tightening the reins. But pride don't feed cattle. Winter's coming, and you're short on hay. You think Sweetwater's gonna sell to you after the fire? You'll be out by Christmas one way or another. Clay stepped closer to the gate. Tell Briggs this. I've survived war, winter, and worse men than him. You come for my land, you better bring more than threats. There was a long silence, broken only by the wind tugging at the flags on the fence posts. Holt's face hardened. Then we'll consider this visit formal notice. He wheeled his horse around. The riders kicked up dust as they galloped off, leaving a silence that pressed heavy over the ranch. Josie acute spat in the dirt. They'll be back next time with more than words. Clay nodded slowly. That's what I'm counting on. That night, Clay and Jose got to work. They reinforced the barn doors with iron bars scavenged from the old mining trail. The few remaining bales of hay were stacked inside the house itself, frisking mice, but safer from arson. The corral was ray-fenced, and hidden rifles were placed in vantage spots along the ridges. Clay also rode into town under cover of dusk. He didn't go to the saloon or the general store. Instead, he stopped behind the old blacksmith shed where a quiet man named Elijah owned a livery stable. Elijah had been a friend of Clay's since the war, a sharpshooter turned horse doctor. Without a word, Clay handed him a sack of coin and a hand-drawn map. "If I don't send word in a week," Clay said, "you ride north. Find Deputy Hale. Tell him to gather men. Show him this." Elijah nodded and tucked the map inside his coat. "You sure you want to go this alone?" Clay looked back toward the shadowed road that led to Red Creek Ranch. His eyes were hard as granite. "It's not about being alone. It's about standing where a man's supposed to." He mounted up and disappeared into the night. The cattle war had begun. The next morning, Clay was up before dawn, the cold air biting through his worn coat as he saddled his horse and rode the perimeter. The early light stretched across Red Creek like gold spilled over. Rust, a few cattle lowed softly in the distance, their breath forming mist in the crisp Wyoming air. For a moment, the land looked peaceful. But peace was a lie. He found the first sign of sabotage near the southern ridges section of fence cut clean. The barbed wire curled like snakes in the dust. About a dozen cattle had wandered off there, hoofprints leading toward the dry creek bed that bordered triple spur land. Clay stared at the wreckage, jaw tight. He dismounted, examined the tracks, and saw two sets of fresh boot prints riders, heavy-footed, likely moving at night. One print had a worn-down heel, the kind left by the man with the scar who'd visited the day before. Clay tied off his horse and began the slow task of repairing the fence. Each staple he hammered into the wooden posts felt like a beat in his chest, solid and deliberate. It wasn't just about keeping cattle in, it was about holding a line. Around mid-morning, Jose rode up, carrying a sack of trail food and a freshly oiled revolver. "They're pushing," Jose said, "watching the horizon, trying to bait you into chasing them. Won't work," Clay muttered. "We hold the line. For now." But the silence between them said what neither would voice aloud. If Briggs wanted war, he was making the first moves. That night, Clay took up watch on the northern ridge where the land sloped gently toward a natural choke point. He built a blind. Among the rocks, just a low perch of brush and canvas, good enough to keep him hidden. He brought a lantern, his rifle, and a worn journal filled with notes about cattle movement and fence patterns. He didn't sleep. Around midnight, the distant sound of hooves echoed faintly through the canyon. Clay lowered the lantern and peered through the scope of his rifle. Moonlight glinted off something metallic, spurs, maybe, or the barrel of a carbine. To riders, slow, careful. One dismounted and knelt near the far fence line. Clay's breath stilled. A snap, the wire being clipped. Another spark. One rider struck a match to careless. Too soon. Clay fired once. The shot rang out like thunder, and one of the men fell with a shout. The second rider turned and galloped off into the dark, bullets snapping at his heels from Clay's rifle. Clay waited a moment, then carefully made his way down the ridge. The man he shot lay groaning near the broken fence, clutching his leg. Blood seeped through his trousers, dark against the dirt. He looked up at Clay, face pale, teeth gritted. "You shoot me in the dark," he rasped. "You cut my fence in the dark." Clay replied coldly. The man tried to speak again, but Clay cut him off. "You're lucky it wasn't higher." Jose arrived minutes later, rifle in hand, and helped Clay drag the wounded man up to the barn. They patched him up as best they could and tied him to a support beam with thick rope. "Briggs'll send more," Jose said grimly. Clay nodded. "Let him. Now we've got leverage." By morning, word had already spread. The story ran through town like wildfire. Clay Thatcher had shot a triple spur rider, folks gathered at the saloon, whispering nervously between drinks. Some called it suicide, others justice. Marshal Dobbins came by that afternoon. "You know what you've done, Clay," he said, standing near the barn. Clay crossed his arms. "Defended my land. You shot one of Briggs' hired men. He'll come now, not with riders, with gunmen. Then I'll meet him at the gate." Dobbins looked tired. "This town doesn't want a range war. This town's already in one," Clay said. "Most folks just don't realize they're losing." He turned and walked back toward the house, leaving the marshal staring at the horizon. Inside the barn, the wounded rider stirred in his bonds. Outside, Red Creek braced for war. By the third day, Clay knew something was different. The land was quiet to quiet. No more fence cutting, no shadows on the ridge. Even the coyotes seemed to be holding their breath. It was the kind of silence Clay didn't trust. Just before noon, a lone rider appeared on the horizon, not galloping, not sneaking, just riding with the calm confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. The man wore a dark gray suit, clean and tailored, the kind of fabric that didn't belong anywhere near dust and barbed wire. His boots shone in the sun, and his gloves were black leather. Behind him came a wagon, pulled by two horses, driven by another man Clay didn't recognize. Clay and Jose stood near the gate. The wounded fence cutter still lay in the barn, his leg bound tight with rags and dried blood. He hadn't spoken much, just muttered curses and threats. Clay hadn't replied. He was waiting for this. The suited man brought his horse to a halt a few paces from the gate. "You must be Mr. Thatcher," he said, smiling like he'd just stepped off a train. "From St. Louis." Clay didn't answer. "My name is Warren Fletcher. I'm an attorney representing Mr. Alton Briggs. I believe we're overdue for a civilized conversation." Clay stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "If Briggs wants a conversation, he can ride here himself." Fletcher chuckled softly. "Mr. Briggs doesn't waste time with stubborn men. That's why I'm here." He sent an offer, a generous one. 10,000 in gold for the land. You keep the house. Your cattle get moved to a parcel in the North Valley. Clay let the silence hang heavy for a moment. Then he spat in the dirt between them. Fletcher's smile faded. "That's a very expensive gesture, Mr. Thatcher." Clay pointed to the wagon. "You bring more hired men, or something else?" Fletcher turned, waving the driver forward. "No men, just this." The driver pulled a tarp off the wagon bed. Inside was a coffin, polished, black, new. A breeze passed through, carrying the scent of pine from the box. Jose crossed himself under his breath. "You think that scares me?" Clay asked, voice low. Fletcher met his eyes. "It should." Clay walked up to the wagon and knocked on the lid of the coffin hard. The sound rang hollow. "You bring this coffin to bury me," Clay said, "but you best bring 20 more to bury your men." Fletcher's eyes narrowed. "The law won't protect you and the people in this town. They'll vanish when the guns come out. You'll die alone." Clay stared back. "Then I'll die standing, and I'll take your war with me." Fletcher didn't respond. He signaled the driver to cover the coffin again. "We'll be seeing you soon, Mr. Thatcher." As they rode off, Jose stepped up beside Clay. "You really think they'll come with 20? "No," Clay said, watching the dust rise behind the wagon. "They'll come with more." That night, Clay wrote a letter, short, direct, and sealed with a bullet mark pressed into wax. He gave it to Jose. "Take this to Elijah. Tell him it's time." Jose looked like he wanted to argue, but instead nodded. "Double quotes when they come," he said, mounting his horse. "Make them earn every step." "I will." As Jose rode into the dark, Clay turned toward the barn, where the wounded man stirred in his sleep. The war wasn't coming anymore. It was here. The next day came like a held breath. The wind was dry. The the sun sharp. Red Creek Ranch sat under a sky too blue to trust. Clay spent the morning preparing tightening fence lines, checking ammo, moving what cattle he could into the upper pasture near the ravine. He'd lived on this land for more than 20 years. He knew its trails, its hiding places, its silent ways. Now, he used that knowledge like a soldier. Around midday, he climbed the north ridge to scan the horizon. Nothing. But Clay's gut told him it wouldn't be long. By late afternoon, hoofbeats rolled in like distant thunder. Clay knelt behind a patch of sagebrush with his rifle resting on a flat rock. Through the scope, he counted the riders 7, not hired hands, not drifters. These men were gunmen, black dusters, rifles and pistols strapped across saddles. Their horses moved with purpose. These weren't men here to talk. They stopped about 200 yards from the house and dismounted. Clay could just make out the scar-faced man from the first group. He pointed toward the barn and made a circling motion with his hand. They're flanking. Clay muttered. He lit the signal flare Jose had left behind, a slow-burning orange puff that rose over the ridge. It was crude, but enough to mark the beginning. The war had begun. The first shot cracked the silence. At sundown, Clay fired from the ridge, dropping one of the riders trying to cross near the cattle pens. His bullet struck center mass. The man went down hard and didn't get back up. The others scattered, taking cover behind rocks, fence posts, anything they could find. Gunfire erupted from below, wild at first, then more coordinated. Clay rolled to his second position, took aim, and fired again. He wasn't shooting to wound. Inside the barn, the wounded fence cutter started yelling. He banged against the beam he was tied to, trying to break free, but Clay had bound him tight. "You think this land's worth dying for?" the man screamed. Clay didn't answer. From the ridge, he could see them trying to light torches, aiming to burn the corral. Clay aimed for the torch bearer and dropped him in the dust before the flame ever touched the post. Still, the others pushed forward. One managed to get behind the water trough and fired toward the house. The windows shattered, the air filled with dust and glass. Clay slid down the ridge and sprinted for cover near the well, bullets cracking past him. He rolled behind a boulder and waited. He was outnumbered, but not outsmarted. That's when the sound came, faint at first, like thunder, then louder. HOOFBEATS. Dozens. From the north trail. A cloud of dust rose. Through it came riders 5, 10, then more. Men with rifles drawn, bandoliers across their chests, horses galloping hard. At the front rode Elijah, his hat low, his eyes locked on the battlefield. They hit the triple spur gunmen like a hammer. Gunfire roared from both sides. The outlaws, now caught between Clay and the newcomers, panicked. Tried to mount up and flee. One was shot off his saddle before he even got a foot in the stirrup. Clay joined the fight from behind, picking off the few who didn't drop there. Weapons. In minutes, it was over. Dust settled. The gunmen lay sprawled across the land, dead or bleeding. A few surrendered. The scar-faced man tried to run, but Elijah tackled him clean off his horse. Clay walked out from behind the boulder, his rifle still warm in his hands. "You got here fast," he said. Elijah grinned. "Didn't feel fast. You all right?" "I'm still breathing." They shook hands, hard and silent, like men who didn't need words. One of Elijah's men rode back to town for the marshal. Clay looked over the bodies. It wasn't over. Briggs hadn't come himself, but this was a message. Red Creek wouldn't fall easy, and Clay Thatcher wasn't finished yet. 2 days after the shootout, Red Creek Ranch was quiet again, but it wasn't peace. Clay Thatcher sat on the porch with his leg wrapped tight and a fresh bruise blooming over his ribs. He hadn't slept much. He couldn't, not with the weight of what was coming. Inside the house, Elijah and 2 of his men were cleaning weapons and reloading shells. They were Rough Riders from the North Valley's men Clay trusted with his back turned. Jose had returned that morning from a supply run to Sweetwater, bringing ammo, food, and news. Elijah's ride made headlines. Jose said grimly, "Town's split. Some folks think you're a hero. Others say you're dragging the whole valley into war. They'll have to choose soon," Clay said. "They already are," Elijah added from inside. "Briggs posted a bounty on your head last night. $500. Dead or alive." Clay didn't react. "He's getting desperate." "No," Elijah said. "He's getting ready." That afternoon, clouds rolled in dark and heavy, low over the mountains. Thunder growled in the distance. The first real storm of the season was on its way. So was Briggs. At dusk, a lone rider arrived under a white flag. He was young, nervous, and soaking wet from the rain that had started falling. Clay met him at the gate. "Message from Mr. Briggs," the boy said, holding out a note sealed with red wax. Clay opened it, read it once, and handed it to Elijah. "You have 24 hours to vacate Red Creek. After that, there will be no quarter. This is your final warning." Clay looked out toward the horizon. "Briggs is bluffing." "I don't think so," Elijah said. "Not this time." That night, the rain came hard. Thunder cracked across the land like gunfire. Clay stood in the barn, staring at the wounded prisoner they'd been holding since the fence cutting. The man's leg was healing, but his eyes were full of fear now. "You know what's coming," Clay said. The man nodded. "He's bringing 20, maybe more. Some of 'em ain't even from around here. Hired killers, not ranch hands." Clay leaned against a beam. "Why work for a man like that?" The prisoner looked away. "Didn't have much choice. Most don't." Clay didn't respond. He left him there, guarded but alive. He wasn't in this fight for revenge. He was in it for the land, for the ranch, and for every man who'd ever been told to move or die. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the sky remained gray, heavy with tension. Around midday, one of Elijah's scouts returned, breathless and wet with sweat. "They're coming." Clay mounted his horse and rode to the western ridge. He saw them, 20 riders at least, a few with rifles slung across their backs. Others carried dynamite. At the front, in a black overcoat and polished boots, sat Alton Briggs himself. The Cattle King had finally come to claim Red Creek with his own hands. Clay rode back to the house, where his men waited behind barricades made from broken wagons and reinforced hay bales. They had for rifles to pistols and courage stitched into their spines. "We hold the line," Clay said. "No speeches, no surrender." Elijah grinned. "Wouldn't have come if you had any." As the riders crested the hill and spread out into formation, the ground seemed to shiver. Clay stood tall at the gate, rifle across his chest, eyes locked on the man who would decide the fate of everything he built. Briggs raised a hand and the attack began. The wind stilled, the land hushed. Even the birds seemed to vanish as Briggs raised his hand and brought it down. Gunfire erupted like thunder. The first shots cracked through the air, sending splinters of wood and dust flying as the attackers charged Red Creek Ranch from the west. Clay dropped behind the barricade near the front gate, his rifle tight in his hands, and fired. One rider fell, then another. Elijah and his men answered from the upper windows of the ranch house and behind overturned wagons. Jose, ever calm in the chaos, moved along the line, reloading rifles and shouting warnings. But Briggs had come prepared. The attackers didn't break after the first volley. They regrouped, flanked left, and pushed toward the barn. 2 men carrying sticks of dynamite made it halfway across the corral before Clay's bullet caught one. The other dropped the fuse and ran until Elijah shot him square in the back. "Push them, don't let them get close," Clay yelled, moving to the sidewall where 3 gunmen had ducked behind a trough. His aim was steady, trained from years of war and wilderness. The trough exploded in a burst of water and dust as his shot rang out, but Red Creek was bleeding. One of Elijah's men took a round to the shoulder. Another was pinned down behind the hay bales. Jose had a graze across his temple, but refused to fall back. Briggs himself hadn't entered the fight, yet he remained just behind the front line, surveying it all like a general on a hill, untouched, unshaken. Until Clay saw an opening. With Elijah covering him, Clay ducked behind the house, took the north trail, and looped around behind Briggs' men. He moved like a ghost, stepping silently through the brush until he reached a boulder within shooting range of the cattle. King Briggs stood tall on his horse, barking orders. Clay raised his rifle. His hands were steady, breath slow, but then he hesitated. He remembered what this fight was about. Not vengeance, not hate, land, freedom, legacy. Killing Briggs would make a martyr. Beating him would send a message. Clay aimed lower and fired. The bullet struck Briggs' shoulder, knocking him clean off his horse. Panic spread. Some of Briggs' men bolted. Others turned their rifles toward the rocks where Clay had fired from. But before they could flank, Elijah's riders pushed forward in a countercharge, sweeping through the scattered outlaws. By the time the dust settled, 5 men were dead. 8 more captured. Briggs, bloodied and groaning, was dragged by his own horse back toward the ridge. The remaining riders, seeing their boss beaten, dropped their weapons and fled. It was over. Red Creek Ranch still stood. By dusk, the bodies were buried out on the far edge of the property. The wounded were bandaged. The prisoners turned over to Marshal Dobbins, who rode in just in time to witness the end. "I didn't think you'd make it," he told Clay. Staring at the smoldering barn, "Neither did I," Clay admitted. Briggs would live, but his power wouldn't. News of his defeat at Red Creek spread like wildfire. His investors pulled out. The triple spur collapsed within weeks. Elijah returned to the North Valleys with half of Clay's herd as thanks. Jose stayed behind, helping Clay rebuild the barn from the blackened skeleton left behind. It would take months to restore the land, years to forget the blood. But the ranch was still Clay's. He stood at the ridge one evening, overlooking the fields where his cattle grazed under a red Wyoming sunset. No more threats, no more warnings. Red Creek was free. And Clay Thatcher, weathered, wounded, unbroken, was still its keeper.